So today I'm giving a talk on an amazing work that's actually in the Fisher Library in the rare books section on Blaise, Cendrars and Sonia Delaunay's artist book called La Prose du Transsiberien from 1913. In 1913, the Ukrainian French artist Sonia Delaunay Turk and Swiss poet Blaise Cendrars collaborated on a unique artist book called La Prose du Transsiberien et de la Petite Johanne de France, translates as Joan of Arc, which featured a poem over 400 lines long by Cendrars, accompanied by an abstract painting by Delaunay. Planned as an edition of 150, just over half were finally printed, and we'll find out why as we go through this talk. But several copies are actually in leading art museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, New York Public Library, Tate Modern, Getty Research Institute, Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, LACMA, and also at the National Gallery of Australia, just to name a few. And you'll see in the image that there are different variations between the various copies, and this is because everything was actually handmade. So everything is a unique artwork. The book itself has captured the imagination of many and has also been recreated a couple of times in recent years. So while copies of the original book are very highly valued, with one changing hands last year at Christie's for over 237,000 euros, I should say, Fisher Library is lucky to have one of the limited edition handmade recreations made by Kitty Merriat and Two Hands Press in 2018. So today we're going to have a closer look at this amazing collaborative endeavour of Delaunay and Cendrars in producing La Prose du Transsiberien and also this remarkable recreation. And here is a photograph of the entire thing in the Fisher Library. Created at a time of heightened artistic and intellectual modern life in Paris, on the cusp of the Great War, this extraordinary work became the first simultaneous book, meaning that it is seen and read at the same time. Delaunay was a key figure in the Parisian avant-garde, and along with her husband, Robert Delaunay, they practiced Orphism, a development from Cubism, and she also pioneered the movement simultanism. This movement, practiced mainly by the Delaunays, is derived from the colour experiments of the scientist Michel-Eugène Chevreul, who in 1839 created a colour theory that was to influence the Impressionists and post-Impressionists such as Seurat. And they both identified a visual phenomenon of simultaneous contrast, meaning that colours are altered and therefore perceived differently depending on the surrounding colours. Hence, Delaunay's work prioritises colour over form to create rhythm, motion and depth. And this is a concept that was also used not only in her paintings, but also a diverse range of artistic output, including costume design, wallpaper, soft furnishings, etc. Even a design for a car. You can see this aesthetic effect very clearly in the artist book. Cendrars, on the other hand, was a central influence in Modernist literature and also poetry, and travelled extensively, including to America, Persia, China and Russia, which became the inspiration for several works, including Transsiberien. Cendrars' method of montage is a device that can also be seen in the work of filmmaker and theorist Sergei Eisenstein, such as in his film Battleship Potemkin from 1925. Cendrars referred to La Prose du Transsiberien as a sad poem printed on sunlight. This half-imagined story, printed here with this unconventional typeset, follows a train journey from Moscow to Paris in 1905, where Cendrars, as a character, travels with a jewel merchant and also with his amie, the little prostitute called Jehan, referred to in the text as "your stomach is sour and you have the clap." The journey is represented not only in Cendrars' text, but also in a small map at the top of the page, which we can see here. And the work itself is actually 2 metres long. As Marjorie Perloff observed, Transsiberien is a text full of contradictions. The long free verse lines, with their paratactic structure and repetition, as Perloff puts it, traces the journey from Moscow to Paris through what can only be thought of as a discontinuous, or in thinking about Delaunay's work, in simultaneous time. And by this I'm referring to lines that describe the past and the present, both real and imagined, and sections that are prescient of the coming war in their violent prose, a war in which Cendrars would lose his right arm. The text also leaps around in space, describing or referring to faraway locations, such as Fiji, Borneo, Java, Japan and Mexico, with the prose regularly intersected by the cries of Jehan asking, "Tell me, Blaise, are we far from Montmartre?" So the text referring to the past, as we can see here, goes as follows, this is an example. "Back then, when I was still young, I was barely 16, but my childhood memories were gone. I was 48,000 miles from where I was born. I was in Moscow, city of 1,000 bell towers and 7 train stations, and the 1,003 towers and 7 stations weren't enough for me, because I was such a hot and crazy teenager, that my heart was burning like the Temple of Ephesus or the Red Square in Moscow at sunset." He also writes in the present tense, "I'm afraid I don't know how to go all the way to the end. Like my friend Chagall, I could make a series of insane drawings, but I haven't taken notes on my way. Forgive my ignorance. Forgive me for no longer knowing the age-old game of poetry. As Apollinaire says, one can read everything about war in the Kuropatkin memoirs or in the Japanese journals that are just as brutally illustrated. To what end document myself? I abandon myself to bursts of memory." Very melancholic text. But he also alludes to the future. And he does this in prose that in some ways you could say is prescient of the coming war. I saw the silent trains, the black trains returning from the Far East and going like phantoms. I went to the hospitals in Krasnoyarsk and at Kilok. We met a long line of soldiers going insane. I saw a quarantine, gaping sores and wounds with blood gushing out, and the amputated limbs danced around or flew up in the raw air. And some scholars, of course, have seen this as an anticipation of his own loss of his arm. Throughout, the poem alludes to conflict and violence, such as that experienced by the author himself of the 1904 Russian-Japanese War. And its overall emotive sense sways from introspection, bleak violence to heavy melancholic dread. The applied colour by Delaunay, on the other hand, is designed to dynamically affect the reader's emotion and to contrast and accord with the poetic mood and sensation, as scholar Mary Shaw puts it. As the poem and the fantastic journey come to a close, the poet arrives in Paris, where desires arrive at the crossroads of restlessness, and he heads to the Lapin Agile for a drink. The montage of sensations, images and narrative fragments, the time shifts from past to present and back again, as Perloff states, all make Cendrars' poem a prescient elegiac homage to the Paris of the avant-garde. This extraordinary text, full of discontinuous spatial and intervallic leaps, is printed on a various sections of papers, 4 sections in all, with at least 38 different typefaces in 4 colours, produced by letterpress, further enhancing the disquieting intersection with Delaunay's painting, which is created by the method of Pochoir. Pochoir is a system of applying the colour using pomme, which are short, wide brushes, and metal stencil plates to form the shapes. The book itself is unconventional in every way. So to read the book, it must be taken out of its sleeve. The concertina pages must be laid as flat as possible. And then, because the book is actually folded down the vertical line, you need to unfold the entire length of paper. So the reader must carefully prise open the doubled leaf in order to lay the spine flat. In other words, the book cannot be seen or read unless it is fully open, so that it is experienced in its entirety. In order to convey some of this wondrous experience, I've taken photographs of the Fisher Library copies so we can peruse the details. So the rich colour you see in this work is only possible using the original Pochoir method of applying the paint and pigment directly to the paper surface using pomme, these fat little brushes that you see here, which are loaded with pigment. The differing tones are determined by the amount of pigment and the applied pressure, and we can see this in a video of Kitty Marriott producing the facsimile edition. So the use of the stencils, then the use of the pomme to physically apply the colour to the surface. And if you can imagine trying to make 150 copies of a 2-metre work like this, Kitty, I think, reproduced the work in 150 copies over, I think it was 2 years roughly. So every colour, of course, is also applied separately. Quite a job. Delaunay's hand application of multiple coloured pigments, along with the typeset text, produces an edition of work with each copy unique in its individually applied colour. The pigment is far from contained as it spills over into the text, butting up against the lettering in a sensual and evocative way. Like the text, which brings a number of time elements together simultaneously, which can be read in a non-linear way, the visual elements are also perceived in fragments and also as a whole. In its entirety, the work can be read simultaneously, or from right to left, left to right, vertically, in reverse, or in sections. Delaunay's complex arrangement of concentric circles, ovals, triangles, rectangles, and splashes of pigment is in and of itself the subject of the painting, as Perloff puts it. As Cendrars writes, a colour is not a colour in itself. It is a colour only in contrast to another or to several other colours. The painting epitomises the development of modernist abstraction at the time, and is, despite one visual reference to the Eiffel Tower, a work of pure abstraction and without subject matter. As Cendrars said about Robert and Sonia Delaunay's work, Delaunay closed the shutters and shut himself in his dark room. He made a little hole in the shutter with a brace and bit. A thin ray of sunlight filtered into the room, and he began to paint it, to analyse all its elements of form and colour. Without knowing it, he was doing spectrum analysis. He worked for months like this, reaching the sources of emotion without any subject matter whatever. Indeed, Transsiberien was created at the time when Futurism, Cubism and later Dada were fostering the convergence of text and image. In fact, the futurists such as Boccioni, Marinetti or Mikhail Larionov and Natalia Goncharova, in their experiments with Rayonism, had also advocated the concept of simultaneity, seen, for example, in Boccioni's 1912 manifesto, where he says the simultaneousness of states of mind in the work of art, that is the intoxicating aim of our art. Simultaneity for the futurists referred to the synthesis of what one remembers and of what one sees. So it's the coming together of these two elements, most particularly related to the successive stages of motion in linear sequence or in the depiction of motion, dynamism and speed, which can be seen quite clearly in Boccioni's work. Not unlike, one might say, of Cendrars and Delaunay's work as text and image that follows the metaphorical journey of a train in which the spatial and temporal distortions are read simultaneously. The work itself caused quite a sensation at the time, with Apollinaire declaring in La Soirée de Paris that Cendrars and Delaunay Turc have carried out a unique experiment in simultaneity, written in contrasting colours, in order to train the eye to read with one glance the whole of a poem, even as an orchestra conductor reads with one glance the notes placed up and down on the bar, even as one reads with a single glance the plastic elements printed on a poster. The work was exhibited from 1913 at the annual Salon de Automne in Paris, and then in Berlin, London, New York, Moscow and St. Petersburg. It became an event, with Victor Smirnov giving an accompanying lecture in St. Petersburg, and in Paris a Madame Lucy Wilhelm stood on a chair to recite the poem hung on the wall, which is, as I said, 2 metres high. The reader had to begin at ceiling level, gradually bending her knees and finally sitting on the chair to read the conclusion. In effect, reading the poem became a performance that followed the train journey and Delaunay's painting in accompanying corporeal movement. Herwarth Walden, who was the editor of De Sturm, organised a Herbstsalon in 1914, showing 366 paintings and sculpture by 90 artists from 15 countries. And this included Ballard, Boccioni, Kandinsky, Delaunay, Léger, Mondrian, Picabia and others. Such was its international reception at the time. And this exhibition was actually one of the last great modernist exhibitions before the war in 1914. So in reading Delaunay's painting Colourfield, we can see that rather than illustrating the text, it instead works synchronously up and down the page. At the top, the blue and violet discs and white shapes can be understood, according to Perloff, as alluding to the abstracted Moscow and its 1,003 bells and white cathedrals. Furthermore, the patches of red and yellow suggest the Red Square and the honeyed fold of the bells as referred to in Cendrars' text. The ensuing swirls of colour, sun, clouds and wheels evoke not just the train journey, but also the unfolding of the poem and the rhythms of the text as it sinks into memories, into lust and into violence. The golden thread of Cendrars' future is visually woven into the work. It's as if Delaunay's coloured forms map the notion of time, folding and unfolding across the page with its broken text, page creases and intersecting elements. Throughout Transsiberien, Cendrars' text and Delaunay's colour come together in symphony, either in contrast or in sympathy. So for example, here we read, "If I were a painter, I would spill great splashes of yellow and red over the end of this trip, because I am quite sure we were all a little mad, and that a raging delirium was bloodying the lifeless faces of my travelling companions." And here's the text, the rest of that text here. So, as Cendrars wrote in De Sturm, Madame Delaunay has made such a beautiful book of colours that my poem is more saturated with light than is my life. Besides, think that this book should be 2 metres high, he says. Moreover, that the edition should reach the height of the Eiffel Tower. If actually put end to end, it would reach the top of the tower. The reference here, of course, to the Eiffel Tower, in text and also in image, is a nod to Robert Delaunay, who painted the famous monument throughout his life and also acts as a reference to the end of the journey. The last line, Paris, city of the incomparable tower, the great gibbet, which is the guillotine, and the wheel, again compresses time and space, which along with Delaunay's reference to the Eiffel Tower as a marvel of technology, fixes La Prose du Transsiberien firmly as an ode to modernism and to the metropolis at the brink of war and destruction. Thank you.
Hi, with the Delaunays, did they have a significant influence on, you said around 1940, around the Cubists, and with Picasso and Braque and people like that? Were they an influence on other movements later in the 20s? You had Dadaism, but you had Expressionism, you mentioned Chagall, and you mentioned Kandinsky as well, with the Blue Rider Group and with the Bauhaus. So were they a significant influence there, or were they just contemporaries?
I'm not certain that there was an influence there, particularly at the time, but certainly those artists tended to know each other and know of each other's work. And particularly Delaunay, who, she really was in that kind of centre of things in Paris. So a lot of those artists who were in Paris, she never really travelled very much. She refused to go to America. I think she saw it as uncouth, culturally uncouth. So all of those people pretty much knew each other, and certainly she and Cendrars lived very long lives. So their influence kind of carried on, of course, in the post-war period. And you see it really, I suppose, at the time. There's Orphism, but there's, as I said, there's Cubism, Dada, Surrealism. Really, it's kind of the avant-garde at the time. We're really feeding off each other across the whole of Europe. And not to forget, of course, that a lot of that influence then went to America, particularly with Gallery 291, exhibiting European artists in New York in the early part of the 20th century, right up until, Duchamp and all of those artists as well. Yeah.
Comparing her work to her husband's, is there a huge difference? Are they very, very different? Or?
Well, so there has been a lot of comparisons between the two. There's also been scholars who basically said that rather than being a footnote to Robert's work, her work is also quite significant but also different in many other ways. So he remained much more as a painter, but she explored much more the ways in which art could be in the everyday. So the idea of, wallpaper, soft furnishings, and clothes. She actually wore what she called a simultaneous dress to a ball. So she really did, she was a walking work of art in a way. But a lot of people also, a lot of scholars seem to think that perhaps some of the works might have been created together, some of Robert's work. And that wasn't uncommon at the time either. So yes, I don't see them as, I don't see her work definitely as lesser than his. I would say that it's equal but very different in the ways in which she applied it. And I think in some ways that also expanded her influence in a very different way as well. I mean, her work is quite remarkable when you look at those, and some of them are huge, really big canvases, which was also kind of unusual in some of the work at that time. So a lot of painters were tending to still remain relatively small, except for, Cézanne, who was painting the big, the bathers around 1906. So yeah, it was quite amazing work. But she continued painting for, decades really. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I have a question too.
Yes.
I was wondering how this work is situated within the genre of artist books. Was that already a well-established genre, or was this kind of helping that?
There were already some artists' books around at the same time, and particularly poetry. There were, poets were printing their own books, but the artist book was around at that time. So this wasn't the first artist book; it was the first simultaneous artist book. But artist books, of course, as you know, are highly collectible. The Art Gallery in New South Wales has a fantastic collection, for example. Then photo books, of course, around the same time took off. But it was a way, I suppose, at the time of democratising art, in terms of being able to make it something that could be disseminated in a much broader way. And a lot would have been handmade as well, so tipping in prints and various other things into books. But, if they were highly automatised, they just had larger print runs. But I think this process of the Pochoir is so demanding that it's no wonder. But, the interesting thing is that Kitty Marryatt's done a lot of research on this as well, and the edition doesn't make sense in terms of the fact that there are some that are numbered, up to around the 60s, which they think was the limit, but then there are some that are numbered up to 150. It's like there's gaps, or else they just numbered them in very different ways, but they still think that not all of them were actually published at the time. Yeah.
That was interesting around that time as well. With Duchamp, he did his miniatures and big box sets. Yes. But his art, even though he produced a very small amount of art since, even now, it's like people just created versions of his and nobody can tell whether they were his or...
Oh, yeah, but he also remade quite a few of the works in the 60s, and they will actually say that in if it's in a collection, because a lot of them were lost as well, like the
rack.
The rack.
He just threw that out.
Yeah, but also I think it's the latrine, those sorts of things that was thrown out in the exhibition. But no, he recreated a lot of them. But also the idea of editioning became one way of being able to sell basically multiples. And you see that later with Joseph Beuys taking up that idea, with flurry. So it became quite a common thing. But every work, of course, is an individual work. Yeah, but I'm sure there's probably other copies out there that are not necessarily correct.
Authentic.
Yeah, like Andy Warhol's boxes. There are a few of those around that are perhaps not quite legit, as it were. Yeah. Right.
I've got one more question.
Okay.
My understanding was that one of the reasons behind this recreation, and possibly others, was to reintroduce the skills of Pochoir, or ensure they weren't lost. Do you know if that has influenced a revival of using that technique?
Well, if you look at Kitty Marryatt's website, she tells the whole story of how she went to, she actually located some people who'd been trained in the method in the 70s. And there was a particular studio in outside of Paris somewhere that specialised in this technique. So she trained with them, and in fact the first few editions of this recreation were made on location with these very experienced artisans. And I think, through that process, but also she's done demonstrations of the method, which I think has kind of in some ways influenced other people potentially. And I think she holds classes and various other things. But it's a method that in some ways is forgotten and remembered again. So the idea of stenciling is quite common in street art and various other things. So it's this whole kind of application of the pigment, I think, which is what makes it quite unique. Yeah.
But it looks like it's supplied dry.
Well, if you look at some of the details, there seems to be some moisture, but then it's like, so it's almost like a liquid, but then she seems to then put the brush into dry pigment. So it seems to be as if that's the way of loading pigment into a brush that is damp. That's how I kind of read it. Yeah. And I think that's how you get that incredible translucent nature to it as well. And then there's some hand-painted parts beyond that to kind of draw out the colour in this much more translucent way throughout the work. Yeah, quite remarkable. I don't know that I'd have the patience, frankly, to do it. Yeah.